You don't lose people because you love them too little. You lose them because at some point, your presence stopped feeling like something they could rely on and started feeling like something they could take or leave. There's a moment in every connection where silence becomes louder than words. Not angry silence. Dramatic silence. The kind of silence that says, I'm no longer chasing you. And for an avoidant person, that silence is confusing at first. Almost unreal. Because they're used to distance being something they create, not something they receive. They're used to pulling back, expecting you to follow. They're used to emotional space being safe, predictable, controllable. But then something changes. You stop over-explaining, you stop proving your worth, you stop trying to earn basic consistency. You stop chasing clarity from someone who keeps choosing confusion. And that's when the dynamic shifts. Because silence, when it's intentional, not reactive, does something powerful. It removes pressure. It removes pursuit. It removes the emotional safety net that allowed them to stay distant without consequences. At first, they feel relief. No more expectations. No more emotional intensity. No more conversations I can't handle. But relief doesn't last long when it's built on loss. Because absence starts doing what presence couldn't. It starts speaking. They notice you're not checking in. They notice you're not reacting. They notice you didn't respond the way you used to. And for the first time, they don't feel chased. They feel replaced by silence. That's where discomfort enters. Not because you are demanding them back, but because you are no longer available in the way they assumed you always would be. Avoiding patterns are not broken by pressure. They are disrupted by contrast. You showing up with less emotional chasing and more grounded absence creates a mirror they can't avoid. And in that mirror, they start seeing something unfamiliar. Not control, not pursuit, not emotional dependency, but distance that they didn't cause and can't easily reverse. That's when the mind starts doing its work. What if I pushed them too far? Or why aren't they reacting anymore? Or did they move on already? Or why does this feel heavier than I expected? And slowly curiosity to emotional uncertainty. Because what they took for granted is no longer accessible on demand. And here's the truth most people miss. It's not your love they suddenly value more. It's the absence of your availability that changes the emotional equation. When something is always there, it becomes background noise. No? When it disappears without drama, it becomes a question mark. But this isn't about manipulation. It's about alignment. Because the real shift happens inside you first. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop shrinking to stay connected. You stop treating inconsistency like something you can fix alone. And in that stillness, something powerful happens. You become emotionally unavailable to the confusion. That's the silent closure. Not a speech, not a final argument, not a dramatic exit. Just a quiet, internal decision. I will not keep reaching for something that doesn't reach back. And paradoxically, that is what makes the avoiding dynamic crack. Because now they are no longer dealing with pursuit. They are dealing with consequence. And consequence creates reflection. Some will come back not because they suddenly changed, but because they finally feel the absence of what they were never fully present for. But here is where strength matters more than emotion. Because when they return, they don't come back to the version of you that was chasing. They come back to the version of you that stopped. And that version doesn't beg. It observes. It decides. It chooses based on consistency, not nostalgia. That is where power shifts permanently. Not in who speaks louder, but in who no longer needs to. Because silence, when it comes from self-respect instead of punishment, does something rare. It forces truth to surface without a single word. And in that truth, either connection becomes real or it finally ends without chaos. Either way, you no longer lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who only understands absence when it's too late. Silent closure is not something that happens in a dramatic moment through a final conversation where everything is perfectly explained. It is not the kind of ending where two people sit down, exchange emotional truths, and walk away feeling equally understood. Instead, it's far quieter, far more internal, and far more powerful than most people realize. It begins when you stop reaching for clarity from someone who repeatedly chooses confusion. It begins when you stop trying to translate inconsistent behavior into hidden meaning. It begins when your energy shifts from a "what do they mean by this" to a "why am I still trying to decode this at all?" At its core, silent closure is the point where emotional exhaustion turns into emotional awareness. You start noticing that you have been doing most of the work, not just in communication, but in maintaining connection, repairing distance, and filling in emotional gaps that were never your responsibility to fill. There's a slow realization that effort has been one-sided for longer than you admitted to yourself. And once that realization settles in, something inside you begins to change. Not loudly, not aggressively, but steadily, like a weight being placed down after being carried for too long. You stop asking questions that were never truly being answered. You stop sending messages that were only keeping you in cycles of temporary relief followed by deeper uncertainty. You stop revisiting conversations in your mind, searching for a version of them that might finally make everything make sense. And the most significant shift is not in what you say to them, but in what you stop saying to yourself. You stop telling yourself that patience will eventually turn inconsistency into clarity. You stop believing that if you just explain yourself better, or love a little harder, or wait a little longer, something will fundamentally change. Silent closure forms when acceptance replaces resistance. Not acceptance of being treated poorly, but acceptance that what you are experiencing is not something you can fix alone. It becomes clear that effort cannot compensate for emotional unavailability, and understanding cannot replace someone's willingness to show up consistently. This awareness is uncomfortable at first because it removes the illusion of control. As long as you are trying, there is a feeling that something can still be changed. But when you stop, you are left with reality, and reality requires a different kind of strength. That strength is not about detachment in the cold sense. It is about choosing not to stay emotionally entangled in patterns that repeatedly deplete you. You begin to notice how much of your peace was dependent on their responses, their timing, their mood, their availability. And in recognizing that, you slowly begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were outsourced to someone else's behavior. Your emotional state stops being an immediate reaction to their inconsistency. Instead, it becomes something you protect rather than something you negotiate. Well, there's also a shift in identity that happens quietly. You are no longer the person trying to be understood by someone who is not fully present. You are no longer the person chasing reassurance from someone who only offers fragments of it. You begin to see yourself as someone who does not need to compete for basic emotional steadiness. And once that identity takes root, the need for closure from the other person starts to dissolve. Because you realize that what you were seeking from them was not just answers, but relief. And relief cannot come from the same place that created the tension. Silent closure is powerful because it removes the audience from your healing. You are no longer performing emotional pain in hopes of being seen differently. You are no longer waiting for them to validate your experience so that it feels real enough to let go. Instead, you let go first and understanding follows later. The silence between you and them is no longer something you try to fill. It becomes something you stand in without fear. Eventually, what remains is clarity without conversation. A quiet understanding that you do not need mutual agreement to move forward. You do not need them to acknowledge your experience for it to be valid. And you do not need a final moment of emotional resolution to decide that you are done participating in uncertainty. Silent closure is not the absence of care, but the presence of self-respect strong enough to no longer seek completion from someone who was never completing the cycle with you in the first place. When emotional distance becomes a pattern rather than an exception, the dynamic starts to shift in ways that are often misunderstood. People tend to assume that avoidance is simply disinterest, but it is usually more complex than that. For individuals with avoidant tendencies, closeness can feel overwhelming, not because they do not feel, but because emotional intensity can trigger a need to retreat and regain internal balance. This creates a push and pull pattern where connection is desired, but sustained closeness feels threatening to their sense of independence or emotional control. In this kind of dynamic, pressure often intensifies withdrawal. The more one person tries to get closeness, clarity, or reassurance, the more the avoidant individual may feel a need to step back. It is not always a conscious decision. It is often an automatic response rooted in how they regulate emotional discomfort. As a result, traditional approaches to fixing distance, such as more communication, more explanation, or more emotional urgency, can sometimes have the opposite effect of what is intended. What changes the dynamic is not escalation, but contrast. When the emotional energy that was once directed outward toward them begins to shift inward, the entire system recalibrates. Absence becomes noticeable in a way presence never was. When you are constantly available, constantly responding, constantly filling the space, there's little room for reflection on your absence because there's no absence to experience. But when you begin to step back, not out of anger, but out of emotional exhaustion or clarity, something different happens in their perception of the connection. Silence introduces uncertainty where there was predictability. For someone who is used to managing distance on their own terms, it creates an unfamiliar experience. They are no longer in control of the emotional tempo. They are no longer deciding when connection happens and when it pauses. That shift can create discomfort because it removes the familiar pattern they were accustomed to. And in that discomfort, awareness begins to form. This is where reflection can start. Not necessarily reflection that immediately leads to change, but reflection that interrupts emotional autopilot. Questions begin to surface internally. The absence of your usual presence creates space where assumptions used to exist. They will always come back, we'll always understand, or they will always be available, are beliefs that no longer feel automatically guaranteed. Instead, there is a gap where certainty used to be. That gap is psychologically significant. It forces the mind to process what was previously taken for granted. It is not the pressure of confrontation that creates this shift, but the absence of it. Without emotional chasing, there is no immediate external force to react against. Instead, the individual is left with the echo of their own pattern and the unexpected stillness that follows your withdrawal. However, it is important to understand that this response is not uniform or guaranteed to produce a specific outcome. Avoidant patterns are not simply switched by absence, nor are they healed by distance alone. What absence does is reveal contrast. It shows the difference between what was consistently available and what is now no longer being offered in the same way. That contrast can lead to awareness, but awareness does not always translate into readiness for change. What often gets overlooked is that silence also clarifies your own position in the dynamic. While the other person may be experiencing uncertainty or reflection, you are simultaneously stepping out of a cycle that may have been draining your emotional stability. You are no longer reinforcing a pattern where inconsistency is met with increased effort on your part. Instead, you are allowing the natural consequences of distance to exist without interference. This is where emotional recalibration occurs on both sides. For them, it may be the realization that access is no longer automatic. For you, it is the realization that your energy does not need to be continuously invested in maintaining something that does not maintain itself equally. The dynamic shifts from pursuit and retreat into observation and awareness. The power of this shift lies in its simplicity. No arguments are needed. No final explanations are required. No emotional escalation is necessary. The change happens through withdrawal of overextension rather than addition of pressure. And in that withdrawal, the emotional field becomes unbalanced in a way that cannot be ignored indefinitely. At the same time, this does not guarantee reunion or emotional transformation in the other person. What it guarantees is clarity. Because avoidance thrives in environments where emotional effort is uneven and where one person continuously compensates for the other's distance. When that compensation stops, the structure of the relationship becomes visible for what it is, not what it was assumed to be. In that visibility, decisions become clearer. You are no longer reacting to potential possibility or temporary connection. You are responding to what is actually present when effort is no longer being amplified by one side alone. And that is where emotional reality replaces emotional interpretation, allowing you to see the situation without distortion. When emotional patterns between two people become imbalanced, one of the most defining shifts happens when pursuit stops. For a long time, the dynamic may have been built on one person constantly reaching, explaining, repairing, or trying to maintain connection while the other remained inconsistent, distant, or selectively available. In that pattern, effort becomes predictable. One person fills the silence, and the other responds only when it feels comfortable or necessary. Over time, this creates an emotional rhythm where imbalance feels normal, even if it's deeply draining for the person doing most of the emotional work. When that pursuit stops, the entire emotional structure loses its stability. The absence of messages, reactions, explanations, or emotional availability creates a space that was previously always filled. At first, this space may feel like relief to the person who was overwhelmed by emotional pressure. But that relief does not remain static. It slowly transforms into something else when it becomes clear that the usual patterns are no longer continuing. The shift from being pursued to being met with silence creates contrast, and contrast is what forces awareness. When someone is consistently being engaged, they can unconsciously rely on that engagement as a form of emotional safety net. Even if they are not fully present, they know the connection is being maintained by the other person's effort. But when that effort disappears, the emotional safety net also disappears. What remains is the reality of the connection without constant reinforcement. This is where internal reflection begins to emerge, not always immediately, and not always consciously, but gradually. The absence of familiar emotional input creates space for uncertainty. Thoughts begin to surface that were previously not given attention because they were constantly buffered by interaction. Questions arise not because someone is forcing them, but because silence leaves room for them to exist. What often goes unnoticed is that pursuit itself can mask emotional consequences. When one person is always chasing, the other person is not fully confronted with the weight of distance because it is continuously being bridged for them. There is little opportunity for emotional accountability when gaps are always being filled. But when those gaps are no longer filled, the reality of distance becomes more noticeable. It is no longer softened by constant engagement. This is the point where emotional contrast becomes powerful. The difference between what was and what is now becomes undeniable. For it is not necessarily that feelings suddenly change, but rather that perception shifts. The connection is now experienced without the constant presence of the person who was previously maintaining it. That absence creates a different kind of awareness, one that cannot be accessed when everything is constantly being managed and repaired by one side. The mind begins to register changes in availability, responsiveness, and emotional presence. These changes create internal disruption because they break expected patterns. Humans are highly adaptive to emotional routines, even unhealthy ones. And when those routines are interrupted, the system attempts to make sense of the disruption. This is where curiosity can emerge, followed by reflection on what has changed and why. However, this reflection is not always immediate or deep enough to result in transformation. Sometimes it remains at the surface level, focused on the absence itself rather than the underlying dynamic that created it. But even surface level awareness is significant because it interrupts emotional autopilot. It forces attention onto the fact that something has shifted, and that shift requires interpretation. For the person who has stopped pursuing, this moment is also transformative. The focus begins to shift away from managing someone else's emotional availability and toward observing their own emotional state without interference. There is a gradual recognition that constant effort does not guarantee consistency from the other side. Instead, it often leads to exhaustion, imbalance, and emotional dependency on unpredictable responses. As pursuit fades, emotional energy that was previously directed outward begins to return inward. This return allows for recalibration. Instead of reacting to every inconsistency, there is space to evaluate whether the connection itself is stable, reciprocal, or sustainable. This evaluation is not driven by emotion in the same urgent way it once was. It becomes quieter, more grounded, and more observational. Meanwhile, the person on the receiving end of the silence begins to experience the relationship differently. The absence of pursuit does not necessarily mean immediate regret or realization, but it introduces a gap that cannot be ignored indefinitely. The lack of engagement changes the emotional temperature of the connection. What was once easily accessible now requires internal initiation rather than external response. This reversal of roles, where the pursuer becomes still and the avoidant or distant person is left with absence, creates the conditions for emotional reevaluation, not because pressure is applied, but because pressure is removed. And in that removal, the emotional system is forced to operate without its usual structure. Ultimately, the shift from pursuit to silence is not about controlling the other person's reaction. It is about exposing the actual balance of effort within the connection. It reveals what remains when one side stops compensating for the other. And in that revelation, clarity becomes unavoidable, even if it arrives gradually and without dramatic resolution. Silence only becomes powerful when it is not used as a tool to provoke a reaction, but when it emerges naturally from a place of emotional self-respect. There is a significant difference between withdrawing to create an effect and withdrawing because you have reached the point where continued engagement no longer aligns with your internal boundaries. One is rooted in control over the other person's response, while the other is rooted in control over your own emotional state. The first keeps you attached to outcomes, while the second frees you from them. When silence is used as a reaction to hurt, frustration, or the desire to make someone realize your value, it still remains emotionally dependent on their response. Even in absence, the underlying intention is often still connected to being seen, acknowledged, or pursued. In that state, silence is not truly silent. It is a form of communication aimed at producing a specific result. And when that result does not come, it can lead to more frustration rather than peace. But when silence comes from self-respect, the energy behind it is completely different. It is no longer about what the other person does or does not do. It becomes about what you are no longer willing to participate in. There is a shift from external validation to internal alignment. You stop engaging in conversations that leave you confused. You stop explaining yourself in circles to someone who consistently misunderstands or disregards your emotional experience. You stop entering cycles where clarity is always postponed and never reached. This kind of silence is not empty. It is full of awareness. It carries the understanding that emotional consistency cannot be negotiated into existence. It carries the recognition that effort cannot be forced to match on both sides through persistence alone. And it carries the acceptance that your emotional energy is not meant to be spent endlessly trying to stabilize something that repeatedly destabilizes you. Self-respecting silence is often misunderstood because it does not announce itself. It does not announce itself. It does not come with warnings or emotional declarations. It simply begins when you decide that your participation in imbalance is no longer sustainable. From the outside, it may look like withdrawal, but internally, it is clarity taking shape. You are no longer acting from urgency or emotional reactivity. You are acting from awareness of what repeatedly drains you. In relationships or connections where inconsistency is present, silence that comes from self-respect disrupts the expectation of continued access. When someone is used to receiving consistent emotional availability despite their own inconsistency, your silence introduces a boundary that was not previously there. However, the purpose of that boundary is not to punish or manipulate. It is to preserve your emotional stability. What makes this form of silence powerful is that it is not seeking negotiation. It does not argue for better treatment. It does not attempt to convince someone to understand your value. Instead, it operates from the assumption that understanding is not something you can force into someone who is not consistently present. It removes the burden of persuasion from your emotional experience. As this silence continues, something important happens internally. The emotional urgency begins to fade. Situations that once felt confusing start to feel more clear when you are no longer inside them daily. Patterns become easier to recognize when you are not actively participating in them. You begin to see how often your energy was being used to compensate for someone else's inconsistency rather than building mutual connection. This clarity does not come from overthinking. It comes from distance. Not distance used as a tactic, but distance created by choice. A choice to no longer stay in environments where your emotional presence is taken for granted. A choice to step away from cycles that require you to constantly explain why you deserve basic emotional steadiness. At the same time, self-respecting silence also removes emotional dependency from outcomes. Whether the other person responds, reflects, returns, or remains distant becomes secondary. What matters more is that you are no longer in a position where your emotional stability is tied to their behavior. This is where real detachment begins. Not detachment from feeling, but detachment from dependence. Ironically, this kind of silence can create movement in the other person, especially in dynamics where emotional inconsistency was previously met with continued pursuit. But the key distinction is that this movement is not the goal. It is not the measure of success. It is simply a possible reaction to a shift in dynamic. The foundation of your silence does not change based on whether they respond or not. Self-respecting silence also has a stabilizing effect on your own emotional system. Instead of constantly reacting, analyzing, or trying to fix what is inconsistent, you begin to return to yourself. Your attention shifts from managing external uncertainty to understanding internal boundaries. You become more aware of what you will no longer normalize in relationships. In time, this silence becomes less about absence and more about alignment. It reflects a decision to no longer participate in emotional patterns that require you to abandon your own needs to maintain connection. And in that decision, there's a quiet but firm reclaiming of emotional authority, not over others, but over yourself. True emotional change in relationships does not begin when someone finally promises to do better, or when they briefly show up differently after distance has been created. It begins much earlier, in the internal moment where you stop adjusting yourself to fit into patterns that repeatedly leave you unsettled. Becoming unavailable to inconsistency is not about shutting people out, nor is it about building emotional walls. It is about no longer participating in dynamics where effort, clarity, and emotional presence are not steady or mutual. For a long time, people often stay in cycles where inconsistency is normalized. One day there is attention, warmth, and connection, and the next there is distance, confusion, or emotional withdrawal. In between those extremes, the mind starts to adapt. It starts filling gaps with hope, interpretation, and patience. You begin to tell yourself that the good moments are the real version of the connection, and the inconsistent moments are just temporary phases. Over time, this creates tolerance for emotional instability. Becoming unavailable to inconsistency starts when that tolerance begins to break, not from one dramatic event, but from accumulation. Small disappointments that were once excused start to feel heavy. Repeated cycles that were once rationalized start to feel predictable in a discouraging way. There is a slow internal shift from a "this will improve" to a "this pattern keeps repeating." And that shift changes how you engage. Instead of reacting to every moment of distance or uncertainty, you begin to observe the pattern as a whole. You stop isolating individual moments and start recognizing the structure underneath them. The structure is what matters. Effort that fluctuates without accountability, communication that appears and disappears without consistency, and emotional presence that depends more on convenience than commitment. Becoming unavailable to this kind of dynamic means you no longer adjust your emotional state to match instability. You stop overextending yourself to restore balance every time it breaks. Instead of trying to pull consistency out of inconsistency, you begin to step back and let patterns reveal themselves without your interference. This is where clarity starts to form, because you are no longer emotionally entangled in the immediate highs and lows. At first, this shift can feel uncomfortable. When you are used to engaging, explaining, and trying to stabilize the connection, stepping back can create a sense of emptiness. The urge to re-engage, to check, to clarify, or to repair can still appear. But the difference is that you no longer automatically act on that urge. There's a pause where reflection begins to replace reaction. In that pause, something important develops. Standards become clearer. Not imagined standards, but lived ones. You start to understand what consistent emotional availability actually feels like, not just what it looks like in ideal terms. And once that understanding becomes grounded, inconsistency becomes easier to recognize and harder to justify. Being unavailable to inconsistency does not mean expecting perfection. It means recognizing the difference between human imperfection and emotional unpredictability that never stabilizes. It is the difference between someone having an off day and someone repeatedly showing up only when it suits them. What's your up? One is natural variation. The other is a pattern that affects your emotional well-being over time. As this awareness strengthens, your behavior changes naturally. You no longer invest the same energy into situations that do not show reciprocal effort. You stop trying to decode mixed signals as if they contain hidden reassurance. You stop treating emotional ambiguity as something you are responsible for resolving. Instead, you allow clarity to be demonstrated, not interpreted. This is where emotional boundaries become real. Not as statements or declarations, but as action. You no longer stay in spaces where you have to question your position repeatedly. You no longer remain in cycles where your presence is taken for granted until your absence becomes noticeable. Your attention becomes more selective, not out of punishment, but out of protection of your own emotional stability. Interestingly, when you become truly unavailable to inconsistency, the dynamic itself often begins to shift. Not because you demanded change, but because the previous structure no longer functions the same way. Where there was once easy access to your emotional availability, there is now space. And that space introduces a new reality for the other person to engage with. But the most important transformation is internal. You are no longer basing your emotional state on whether someone is currently showing up or withdrawing. Your stability is no longer outsourced to fluctuating behavior. Instead, it becomes anchored in your own ability to recognize what you will and will not continue to participate in. Over time, this creates a quiet but powerful form of clarity. You begin to notice that peace is not found in waiting for someone to become consistent. It is found in no longer remaining in places where inconsistency is the default. And once that realization settles in, your decisions become simpler, because you are no longer negotiating with patterns that repeatedly undermine your emotional balance. Real closure does not arrive as a final message, a perfectly explained conversation, or a moment where the other person finally understands everything you felt. It does not depend on their acknowledgement, their apology, or their return. It is not something they give you. It is something that forms inside you when you stop waiting for external validation to complete your emotional story. As long as you are waiting for someone else to confirm your experience as valid, you are still partially tied to them emotionally, even if the connection has physically or practically ended. The beginning of real closure happens when you stop treating unresolved questions as something that must be answered by the other person in order for you to move forward. There are many situations where clarity is never fully provided, where communication ends abruptly, or where explanations are incomplete and inconsistent. In those moments, the mind naturally tries to continue the story, to find missing pieces, to construct meaning out of partial information. This is where emotional attachment often continues long after interaction is stopped. But real closure starts forming when you recognize that understanding everything is not a requirement for letting go. You begin to separate clarity from completion. Clarity may or may not come from them, but completion is something you choose for yourself. You stop placing your emotional peace in a future moment where they finally explain themselves in a way that makes everything make sense. Instead, you accept that some experiences remain unfinished in explanation, but still finished in participation. This shift is subtle but powerful. It moves you from a position of emotional dependence on resolution to a position of internal decision-making. You begin to evaluate the connection not by what it could have become under ideal circumstances, but by what it consistently was in reality. This distinction is important because emotional attachment often lives in potential, while real closure lives in patterns that were actually experienced. As this understanding deepens, the need for contact begins to lose its emotional urgency. You may still remember the person, still recall moments, still feel echoes of attachment, but those memories no longer demand action. They no longer push you toward reopening conversations that have already reached their natural end. Instead, they become part of your past without requiring continued emotional investment in the present. Real closure also involves releasing the belief that your worth is tied to how someone else responded to you. In many emotionally imbalanced dynamics, people unconsciously start measuring their value through the behavior of the other person. If the other person is distant, inconsistent, or unavailable, it can slowly create internal questions about adequacy or importance. Closure begins when you stop using someone else's capacity to show up as a reflection of your own value. At this stage, you start recognizing that inconsistency is not a puzzle that needs solving about your behavior, but a reflection of the other person's capacity for emotional presence. You stop rewriting yourself in order to make sense of their distance. You stop adjusting your understanding of what happened in order to preserve emotional connection. Instead, you allow reality to remain as it is without editing it to reduce discomfort. There is also a shift in how memory functions. Initially, memories may trigger longing, confusion, or the desire to revisit what was lost. But as closure strengthens internally, those same memories begin to lose their emotional charge. They still exist, but they no longer dictate your decisions. You can recall them without feeling pulled back into the emotional cycle they once belonged to. What makes real closure powerful is that it is independent. It does not require agreement. It does not require mutual understanding. It does not require the other person to validate your perspective or acknowledge your experience. It exists even in silence, even in unanswered questions, even in incomplete endings. It is not built on what is said between two people, but on what is accepted within one person. Over time, this acceptance reduces internal conflict. You are no longer arguing with reality in your mind. You are no longer replaying conversations in hopes of finding a different outcome. You are no longer waiting for a version of the past to change itself. Instead, you begin to relate to the experience as something that is already concluded, even if it did not conclude in the way you expected. And in that conclusion, something stabilizes. Emotional energy that was previously directed toward interpretation, waiting, or hoping becomes available again for your present life. You begin to reconnect with yourself without the constant interruption of unresolved attachment. The situation no longer defines your emotional state. It becomes part of your history rather than your ongoing internal dialogue. Real closure, in this sense, is not forgetting. It is no longer needing the past to be different in order to move forward. It is the moment where your forward movement is no longer waiting for permission, explanation, or resolution from someone who is no longer actively part of your emotional present. In the end, real closure is the quiet moment where you stop asking unanswered questions to behave like unfinished business. It is when your mind no longer returns to what happened in search of a different outcome, and your heart no longer waits for someone else to define what it meant. Not the dramatic changes on the outside, but everything shifts within. The connection loses its power to pull you back. Not because it was fully understood, but because you finally accepted that understanding. Everything was never the requirement for moving forward.